Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. I don't know if you know this, but a long time ago, I wrote a book called Moving Violations, Automobiles, Experts, and Regulations in the United States. As the title suggests, it's a history of automobile regulation in America. And I wanted to frame this history as beginning with the introduction of the first internal combustion engine vehicle in the US in 1893 and running until, well, that was the question. It's an issue that historians and other kinds of scholars run into when they are attempting to tell a story that basically comes right up to the present. It was clear that I didn't need to cover everything that was going on. My goal really was to put the period that ran from the 1990s to the 2010s in historical perspective, to say how it all fit into a much larger arc. But there were a lot of interesting things changing at that time. Automakers were putting increasing numbers of computers, sensors, and other electronics into vehicles, and it was changing all kinds of things and creating new tensions. For example, right-to-repair activists and some mechanics were worried that car companies were going to use intellectual property and electronic controls to lock down repair services and make it so that for an increasing number of repair jobs, you would have to go into a dealership. Deeply fascinating, but also a lot to cover. But one of the beautiful aspects of being a part of communities of inquiry is that every once in a while, you can see a great topic laying just over there, but feel that you probably don't have it in you to also do that work. And then lo and behold, you find out that someone great is doing it or is going to do it. That's how I felt when I met today's guest, MC Forelle. MC is an assistant professor of engineering and society at the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia. For years now, they have been doing fascinating work examining the sociology of repair work in the face of what MC has called chipification. Increasingly, they have also expanded out to look at other automotive topics, including autonomous vehicles and internal combustion engine bans, often with a focus on what those topics mean both for the environment and repair, as well as a more general focus on what the rise of software engineering means for the auto industry as a whole. In this wide-ranging conversation, MC and I talk about their work, including the kinds of neat research methods they've been up to, like what are sometimes called conference ethnographies, which is hanging out at industry conferences and seeing what's on experts' minds. MC is a person whose work has always gotten me revved up. I think you'll see that. I hope the same is true for you, which is why I say, hey, get excited! MC, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's good to be here.
So here's a really unfair ask for you. Could you kind of give the people a sense of your overall project in the last several years and kind of what you've been up to with the sociology of auto repair? I mean, maybe you could start with your dissertation, for instance, if that's helpful.
For sure, for sure. I really like to tell the story starting at the beginning because I think it helps explain some of my idiosyncrasies. So I did an undergrad degree in film studies and thought I was going to work in music videos for many years and graduated in December of 2007. So the timing was bad.
Yeah.
And then just started hanging out. I was living in Boston at the time, started hanging out around Harvard, and the Berkman Center, now the Berkman Klein Center, would host free talks that were just open to the public that often included like lunch. Um, and so I would go to those talks and discovered that my interest in media and media technologies, because I was doing a lot of work in like interactive music videos at the time, um, was something that I could study and not just make. And so that led me back to graduate school, doing a lot of work in music videos and internet technologies. Like, what does the internet is the internet doing to music videos? Um, and from there, as I went into my PhD, I was trying to explore, dissertation topics, and was really interested in copyright. Was really interested in like um, sort of legal regimes that affect the things we make and the things we consume. Mostly focused on media at the time, but at that time, this was in like 2016, 2017. As I was looking up copyright stuff, I saw all these headlines about how copyright was being used to keep people from repairing and modifying their own cars. And I was just like, that's weird.
Mhm.
That doesn't seem right. And as I dug into it, I found this whole world of people who were really engaging in some concerted advocacy to change the way that copyright works in the United States. And
Mhm.
so that's what my dissertation was about, was looking at this copyright law that was in fact being used at the time to keep people from repairing, maintaining, and modifying their own cars, and studied the people who were trying to push against it.
Mhm.
So the EFF, iFixit, a lot of like repair advocacy orgs, but also the people who were going to be affected by it. And so spending a lot of time with car hackers,
Mhm.
repair specialists, just hobbyists, trying to understand for them what this law meant in
Mhm.
terms of like what they were going to be able to do, third party aftermarket people, how this was going to affect their business. Um, and on the strength of that, got very lucky to spend some time at Cornell Tech as a postdoc. Um, and uh, sort of realized that if you're going to be writing about automotive technology, inevitably you're going to start writing about electric and autonomous vehicles.
Mhm.
And that's the work that brought me here to UVA,
Okay.
is sort of continued to expand where the question of copyright and automotive repair is relatively settled. Questions about how emerging technologies are going to impact the repair ecosystem, the automotive repair ecosystem, automotive technologies, um, I think remain pretty contested. And so
Mhm.
I'm still working in that space, even if not directly on copyright strictly anymore.
Yeah. How cool. I mean, we'll get into all kinds of aspects of this. Before we do that though, I mean, did I learn in an email from you this morning that you just got back from the New York International Auto Show, is that right?
I did. I went for a day to see what the buzz is right now in the industry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so what kind of buzz were you looking for and what'd you find there?
Yeah. Well, the first thing um that was kind of funny, this is a bit of a non sequitur, but an earthquake happened in New York.
Oh yeah.
And so I got a flurry of texts from people being like, "Hey, there was an earthquake. Did you feel anything?" And I'm like, "No, I was literally test riding in a Hyundai Ioniq 6, but the performance model. Um, and the driver had me going at 1.5 Gs in the Javits Conference Center, literally the moment that the earthquake happened. So
Wow.
I did not notice the earthquake.
And
Um,
1.5 Gs is like that's 0 to 60 in I don't know, nothing or something?
yeah, which was like such a wild thing. I'm like, what? I don't, this is not enjoyable for me. I don't know
Yeah.
why anybody needs the capacity to do this in a
Right.
car that's meant to be sort of like a commuter. Although it was a performance model and those things are a little different, but
Yeah.
even so. But yeah, it was a really interesting event. Interesting to see who was showing there and who wasn't. Notably, Tesla had no presence at
Yeah.
the auto show whatsoever. And interesting to see what automakers see as the selling points for their vehicles right now.
Mhm.
Um, I'm still processing it. This was
Yeah, of
literally 2
course,
days
of
ago, but
course.
it was a really interesting window, and the first of many fieldwork trips I'll be taking this year. So
That's cool. I mean, was there any kind of standout things about what their sales points are right now, or
yeah, well, interestingly, basically everyone's presentations looked roughly the same, with the
yeah?
exception of Subaru,
Huh.
which I suppose should not have surprised me. But Subaru had this whole section of their presentation that was just about the longevity of their vehicles.
Mhm.
Statistics about how many Subarus are still on the road after 10 years.
Mhm.
They even had a Subaru there that had been one of their like front impact crash test cars.
Mhm.
Um, which was really cool. They were, like, really advertising that Subarus are cars that you maintain and cars that you can repair and cars that will last a long time, and that's really one of my concerns when it comes to electric vehicles or any vehicles with autonomous technologies in them,
Yeah.
is I know what industry track records are for how long software gets maintained. Like,
Yeah.
you have your phones and you replace them every 3 to 4 years because the software just is no longer supported by
Yeah.
the developer. But now we're putting software in our cars. So,
Yeah.
like, how's that gonna work out? And Subaru seemed to be trying to, like, preempt that and say, like, "We build our cars to last. We support our cars to last." And
That's
that was
really
really
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, totally. Um, well, I feel like why don't we step back and like before we get into like intellectual property and stuff, I feel like you had this nice essay, The Material Consequences of Chipification. And I feel like, the an important bit of background here is the history of adding computers to vehicles and then, the consequences that come with that. And by the way, I mean, I think that if you talk to the right to repair people like Gay Gordon Byrne and Kyle and all these characters, they'll tell you that adding computers to things is like the fastest way to make sure it doesn't live very long, right? I mean, we're adding chips to all kinds of things, which has real problems for our waste stream. But anyway, let's go back. I mean, like, how do you well, give us a short version of like the adding of computers to cars and kind of like where or how that happened?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such an important history to be aware of just because, at the very least, I think it combats the sense that computers and cars was always inevitably going to happen.
Yeah,
And I hate the word inevitable, especially when we talk about technology. Um, but it's a really interesting story about this, like, the combination of private industry, military technology, and public interest regulation,
yeah,
where uh, it was all down to California, right? So California has the California Air Resources Board, which is has long been sort of um, the place where new automotive regulations get made, but this was the
yeah,
beginning of it. And so they were struggling with, especially their major cities being in valleys, Los Angeles and San Francisco, um, the way that the air gets captured in those valleys, car culture in those cities was creating a lot of smog,
yeah.
um, in ways that other parts of the country weren't really dealing with. And so the California state government was like, we need to do something about this. And they told automotive manufacturers, you have to reach these emission standards by this date. And I'm still trying to figure out, and I'm doing some really deep archival work on this right now, why they decided, and I apologize for these little noises.
Don't worry about that.
I apologize, or why they decided, rather, that these emission standards were reasonable to set for this amount of time. Like, they must have
Mm-hmm.
been in conversation with people about what automotive technology would be capable of.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm still digging into the archives to figure that
And this is
out.
in the
But
'80s. This is happening, or is it early
no, this
'90s?
is the 60s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah, so this is just before the Clean Air Act was signed
okay.
into law. And the Clean Air Act came because California was making all these moves.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was the moment where automotive manufacturers were like, well, the only way we're going to meet those emission standards is if we shift from mechanical carburetors to something that can make calculations on the fly, like more sophisticated, detailed calculations about air fuel ratios,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they turned to electronic fuel injectors, which were the first microchips to appear in like mass market consumer vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And it went really bad for a while. They were not very good. They were not very reliable. Like some of these electronic fuel injectors would just cut out if you went under power lines, like really, really charged power lines.
Okay.
Just whoop. So it wasn't until the like late 70s or early 80s that they became more reliable and therefore more the industry standard. But that was the beginning of it. And then from there, we got power windows and other electrical and electronic sort of
Yeah.
forms of control in the vehicle that then got consolidated into engine control units, which are like the central brain, computer brain of the car. And some recent work I've done sees this sort of like development as something that car manufacturers started realizing they could use to, you know, gather data about drivers or put things behind paywalls or increasingly like the subscriptionization of cars that we see now is traceable back to these decisions that were made in the mid 20th century about fuel emissions. And the way that we were going to clear our skies is by not pushing for public transportation or limiting cars in our cities, but building cars that would be electronically designed to be better.
Yeah. So now bring the intellectual property story into it for us. Is this the DMCA? So what is this thing? And what how does it connect to this story?
Oh man, it's funny how much of these things like happened concurrently without any knowledge of each other, right? So basically at the same time in the 60s, late 60s, Congress was really trying to update the Copyright Act. It hadn't been updated since like 1909. And you can imagine how many things had changed in terms of like copyrightable things in those decades. And Congress at the time was really concerned about this machine that had just been developed that was going to change the distribution of the written word. And they needed someone to look into it. And so they set up this little commission and they're like, hey, Xerox machines are the real challenge. These things are the real threat to copyright. You need to figure out Xerox machines, photocopying machines. And while you're at it, maybe consider the question of software. I don't know, it's this new thing. Maybe you haven't heard about it. It might not even wind up being a thing, but we should figure out software while you're figuring out photocopying machines. And so it took them almost a decade, this commission, and they finally determined that they, addressed the photocopying machines. But as far as software goes, they were like, okay, given the forms of intellectual property protections we have in the United States, the only one that we think makes sense, and a lot of people weren't happy about this, but even they sort of agreed that we didn't have a better alternative, is copyright, which is weird for all sorts of different reasons. But so copyright is the form of IP that we grant to software. So fast forward to, I believe it's 1998. I always forget if it's 98 or 96. This is the time of like Napster. Napster has come out and the creative industries are freaking out about it, right? And they need Congress to do something about Napster, about peer-to-peer file sharing, which they see as a form of copyright infringement, right? And not just Napster, but this was also when we had home PCs that were capable of ripping things from a CD or from a DVD onto the hard drive of the home PC. And so they urged Congress, they lobbied really hard. There are great histories about this, as I know that you know, that they got this law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which was an update to the Copyright Act that put in a bunch of protections for the creative industries, among which is this section called Section 1201, which is colloquially known by the absolute like tongue twister, the anti-circumvention provision,
Hmm.
which basically says that if you have a firewall around any piece of creative expression, bypassing that firewall is itself an illegal act. Whether or not then by bypassing it, then you do something copyright infringing with the creative expression behind it, doesn't matter. Just the mere act of bypassing the firewall is an illegal act.
Hmm.
But Congress also understood that technology is advancing very quickly, blah, blah, blah. So they built in this process called the triennial exemptions, hearings, or proceedings. So every 3 years, people could come and say, like, hey, the way this law is written would apply to this use of a technology that should be considered like legal, that should be
Yeah.
made legal.
Fair. Yeah.
It's fair use or something else, right? It's not copyright infringement. And so around, so this happens every 3 years. So when I was beginning to write my dissertation in 2017, people were gearing up for the 2018 round of hearings.
Hmm.
And this is where they were beginning to argue that this exemption should be granted for things like automotive technologies because the software that runs on cars in many cases was protected by a firewall, and you would need to bypass that firewall in order to access that software. And accessing the software is a necessary step in many very mundane repairs.
Yeah.
And even beyond the mundane repairs, like the fun forms of modification and hacking that people like to do with their cars.
Yeah.
So that's a
Mhm.
sort of like 60-year history there.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And so were the right to repair folks, I mean, was part of the argument that the automakers were using these laws and technologies to kind of lock things down? Was it seen as like an intentional thing, or is that not so clear?
So it's not super clear. In most of my research, I haven't actually been able to find a case that went to court where the automakers were taking anyone to court for this sort of infringement.
Mhm.
Um, it My impression from my research was that it was more that the automakers were aware it was a possible lever that they could
Yeah.
use and wanted to keep that lever.
Keep the
Um,
lever. Yeah. Sure.
More often, what automakers were really engaging in were violations of like the Moss Magnuson Act about warranties and stuff
Uh-huh.
like that. Now, while automakers weren't making use of this, there were other like not similar, but other electronics manufacturers beyond what you would typically think, like beyond the creative industries who were doing this. So printers, printer manufacturers, there's a pretty notable case
Mm.
with Lexmark.
Mhm.
A garage door opener manufacturer is another really notable case
Yeah.
that made use of this. Um, so I think the impression I got was that automakers saw that stuff happening and were like, we could use this to
Yeah.
lock our stuff down to protect it. But I never actually saw them use it.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes just having a lever around
Yeah.
is,
Oh,
desirable, right?
John Deere is the other one.
Yeah, John Deere and
Yeah.
Apple are like the famous cases, right?
Yeah. So it wasn't the automotive manufacturers, but they saw their counterparts in agricultural
Yeah.
equipment, tractors and things like that,
Yeah.
who were much more aggressive about this.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. And so where does the DMCA stuff sit now? Have things shifted, or yeah, where's it
Yeah.
at?
So this year is 2024. It's been 6 years. So now we're in for another round of hearings. In 2018, um, advocates won. They got the exemption with some really notable caveats. The exemption was broadened even further in 2021, again with some notable caveats. The caveats that and I'm sure there are going to be some like legal commentators who listen to this and will want to correct me. So grain of salt. But my understanding is that the exception to the exemption, the sort of double negative, whatever, is anything that uses data that is transmitted or That one I'm more fuzzy on. The more notable one to me is any system that is accessible through a subscription service.
Okay.
So those you cannot bypass the firewall if you access that feature through a subscription service.
Right. And you can see why firms would certainly want that. But you can but also earlier you also mentioned that like subscription is increasingly like a model in the auto industry itself, with this like Tesla being a key example, right?
Oh yeah, Tesla, and in terms of like features like full self-driving, which for those of you who aren't watching the video, I'm putting big bunny ears around that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, the mislabeled full self-driving,
Yeah.
um, and in terms of battery capacity. But there are other automakers who are doing that and more. BMW, most notoriously, with they tried to make their heated seats accessible through a
Good.
subscription feature.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And in Korea, South Korea were uh, what's the word? Trying out a feature where a high beam assist, so like an AI, an automated system would turn your high beams on and off.
Uh-huh.
Would only be available through subscription service. Automakers are investing in subscription services really, really heavily. The entire industry seems to be shifting towards that being a major profit
Yeah.
model for the industry. And so this carve out for subscription services, and as far as like the ability to access it for repairs, was kind of like a little breadcrumb where I was like, huh, that's weird.
Yeah,
Why are they
yeah.
doing that? And then I followed that and saw now that's the trajectory that they were anticipating for their
Yeah.
industry.
Hmm. So one thing, I mean, we started with you talking about this auto show in New York, but this is something you've been doing for a while, is doing kind of like conference ethnographies. And I remember during COVID days, you were like attending like virtual mechanics conferences, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, what were those about, and what were you kind of paying attention to in those circles?
Huh. That's a great question. So this was mostly events put on by the Specialty Equipment Manufacturers Association, which is the industry like representative membership organization for aftermarket manufacturers.
Yeah,
So anyone who manufactures equipment that you would put on your car after it leaves the dealership lot is
nice.
considered an aftermarket manufacturer. Um, and a lot of these were about the ones that I attended anyways were specifically the ones that were oriented towards people trying to figure out how to make sense of ADAS features. ADAS is Advanced Driver Assistance
Uh huh.
Systems.
Uh huh. Yeah.
And so it's this like big umbrella of systems that are um, sort of like if you know the levels of autonomy
Yeah.
that the SAE has, like level 0 to level 5,
Mm-hmm.
right? ADAS features typically fall in like level 1, sometimes level 2 sort of things, where it's like lane keep assist
Yeah.
and parallel parking assist and things
Yeah.
like that.
Radar actuated cruise control, is that an example?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, adaptive cruise control, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so all of these fall under the umbrella of ADAS, and they are these systems that require a combination of really, really sophisticated computer systems like programs and a really, really sophisticated and complex array of sensors.
Yeah.
Um, and for people who are both in the third market manufacturing industry, but also I attended some events for repair and collision industries,
Mm-hmm.
like figuring out how to either build products that can integrate with these systems or repair these systems when they are broken
Yeah.
was really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Really, and continues to be really hard. It continues to be a really big challenge for both those industries. And so during COVID times in particular, when people were like, this is when the supply chain was really breaking down,
Yeah.
like
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
the automotive market was just going absolutely haywire.
Yeah.
and parts were hard to get and things like that. Like the
Chips are
repair,
nowhere. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
And so they were just like trying to figure out how to deal with all of that together.
Totally fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen some news articles on the fact that I think Wall Street Journal and others have covered the fact that as we add all these sensors, it's making some kinds of repairs, and if you have a minor accident or something, really expensive. Which I think is kind of like, if you talk to the right repair people and the kind of people who study maintenance and stuff, it's kind of almost like a general rule, right? I mean, as we make these systems more complex and add all these sensors and crap, it just adds this whole other layer of complexity to our technologies that then end up being like cost increases for folks, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was a recent headline that Hertz, the rental car company, is getting rid of a very sizable chunk of their Tesla fleet because
Yeah,
they do not have the repair and maintenance people
to
labor
do
to
it.
maintain the fleet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing, I would love to see stuff about is like what this is going to mean for like the secondhand market. Because I mean, this is like the secondhand market is so important for poor people in this and other nations, and yet they people we know from like studies of household incomes and stuff, people already can't afford repairs, and now you're just adding a whole other layer to it, right?
Yeah, I will be fascinated to see fascinated and horrified at the sort of like
Yeah,
morbid fascination, because so many of the cars that other parts of the world rely on are secondhand cars that come from the United States, but especially for
yeah,
cars that are being built on to support a subscription model in particular.
yeah.
Like, like how are those going to work once they leave the main subscription market? The other thing, speaking of the secondhand market, so something we saw in response to John Deere's efforts,
Mhm.
both in terms of their efforts to frustrate independent repair, which not a thing that farmers take kindly to,
No, they do not.
um, for reasons both of culture and of necessity, right?
Yeah,
Um, what happened in the agricultural equipment market was that the market for secondhand low tech old school
yep,
tractors skyrocketed,
yep,
skyrocketed. And I think
yep,
we're going to see, I my money would be that we're going to see something similar like that to the United States,
yep.
especially as automakers start moving towards um, designs where there's just the central screen and there's no knobs, there's no
Yeah,
buttons, there's
yeah,
no
yeah,
dials. Um, the market for dumb cars,
yeah. I would love to. All the time I'm talking about betting markets around technology. There's like one of my, I really want to see more betting markets around markets and technologies. But and I don't want to be the bookkeeper. I want someone else to do the hard work.
yeah,
Like coming, but I would put that my money in the square with you. And I think I think you could a kind of safe bet, it seems to me, if we're right about that earlier bet, is we'll also see kind of like countercultures, maybe even especially conservative countercultures around this stuff of like pride in dumb cars as kind of, fuck you to EV pushes and stuff like that. Seems like a safe bet.
yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think it'll be this sort of interesting confluence. Like we already know that there's resistance within conservative parts of the country to EVs
Yeah,
for reasons to do with like climate change denial and that sort of stuff.
sure.
Um, but I wonder now, as concerns about the privacy and security issues that come with these very data driven cars get to be in the headlines, whether that like is just going to merge with the people who are also resistant to EVs. 'Cause
Yeah,
EVs are all data driven. They're being built right now to be very data, like do a lot of data gathering, do a lot
yeah,
of data processing, right? And so we'll see this really interesting combination there. I
yeah,
mean, that's my hottest take, my number one hot take, especially I'm sure you experience this a lot being in very engineering oriented institutions, is that we will never have autonomous vehicles. We will never, ever, 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 ever have level 5 autonomy because level 5 autonomy, from everything I've read, realistically relies on every car on the road also being level 5 autonomous.
Yeah.
And have you talked to vintage
Yeah,
car
yeah,
dudes?
I know. Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Like never will you get them to give up their like
mm,
1950 whatever Pontiac whatever, right? Like
yeah,
it's just not going to happen.
yeah. Well, we'll talk more about the autonomy thing in a bit, but, there's I mean, I also just imagine part of my, kind of imagination here when we're in this betting market together uh, is, like, the rolling coal type crowds, you know what I mean? Like, these people who, like, take apart the emissions controls on their vehicles to make them dirtier. You could easily see them coming into the auto market too, and and there'd be kind of identity around these things.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the VW emission scandal wasn't that long ago. It doesn't even
Yeah.
need to be just the rolling coal guys, right? Like this was
Right.
Volkswagen of all companies.
Right. Yeah. Well, and your fixers too. I mean, one of the the people, the tuners or whatever we call them, the people who get in and play with the software in their cars to like do performance type things. Obviously, like I mean, it's totally fascinating in a subcultural way, but those vehicles are also running pretty dirty and having emissions impacts while they're doing that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the it is unfortunate that for the most part those tuners, the people who do performance racing as like a hobby, frequently but not exclusively, and not always, but frequently, do tend to use the car that they race with as their daily driver.
Yeah.
And that's the problem there. I think there's like an auto industry commentator that I follow, I think who writes for the Autopian now. Um, Shout out to their amazing coverage. I really like that venue, but who said that like he would prefer to live in a world where cars are a genuine hobby, where cars are like the thing you do on the weekend. Um, and so and I kind of buy that, right? Like performance racing, I think has a place in this world as a hobby that you might engage in, and the emissions from performance racing, I mean, NASCAR is a different thing, but like, your drag racers, your weekend warriors, right?
Yeah.
Um,
It's a
is a drop in
pittance.
the bucket compared
Yeah.
to the emissions from commuting.
Sure.
And so like
Yeah.
if they just left those dirty cars at the track on the weekends and then got into something cleaner, um, I could see it. But for many, especially now that it's so expensive to own more than one car, like
Yeah.
their
Yeah. Yeah.
play car is also their work car, and that's a problem.
Sure. I got a couple other places I want to be sure to go with you before we sign off in a while. But so the one is you're giving a talk soon called something like the dubious promise of an internal combustion engine bans. I want to talk to you a bit about that. So what's your angle on that? And then I wanted to connect it to some other episodes we've had here on the show.
Yeah. So, this is it's one of the both fun and like frustrating things about writing about automotive technologies is that they don't stop for a minute. They don't rest.
No, they don't.
And the same thing with like automotive regulations. So the Biden administration has in a couple different ways issued made moves to move the US at a federal level towards internal combustion engine bans. It's already been adopted by the entire West Coast. California started it. Oregon and Washington have also adopted it. A few other states. Um, Almost all of Europe has adopted internal combustion engine bans. So all gas powered cars will cease to be sold in these places in 2035 for the most part. It ranges a bit. Um, and I am concerned about that because it sort of it is echoes of the same techno solutionism that got us electric fuel injectors in the first place. That the way to solve automotive emissions is just to build cars that emit less.
Hmm.
And with these moves in particular, my concern is that, and research is still ongoing. I'm still looking into the actual text of these things. One of them was released like literally 3 weeks ago. So there's a
Hmm.
lot to look through. Um, is that I'm not seeing in these bans any sort of support for the repair ecosystem that
Yeah.
would need to be ramped up significantly to support
Yeah.
um, these new fleets of electric vehicles.
Right.
This is partially inspired by a dissertation I read when I was writing the Chipification paper by a scholar named Stuart Savin. I might be mispronouncing his name, who wrote his dissertation on how difficult it was for community colleges to update the curriculum for automotive repair programs.
Yeah.
For lots of reasons. They're underfunded. The sort of accreditation process, like to get any sort of updates through the accreditation process, is really onerous. But basically making the case that like the places that train our automotive technicians are having a very difficult time making sure that they are up to date on automotive technologies. And this was a dissertation written a while ago, but I reached out to him as I was writing my own, and he sort of echoed the sentiment that this is still something that he sees in the industry as being a problem, that we're just not investing in the trade schools, the vocational programs, the community colleges that produce our repair technicians.
Yeah.
And so how can we expect to have this fleet of electric vehicles when we're not investing in the repair infrastructure necessary to maintain them? So that's the main concern, is that.
Yeah.
And then there's also, I think I'm hoping to build off of work that colleagues of mine are doing in looking at the scale of lithium extraction necessary and what that's doing in those spaces, and cobalt mining for all the chips that we need for this stuff, and sort of being in conversation with the work that's being done on that end as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So I've had a couple episodes with Bob Charette, who wrote this. He's an engineer who wrote this thing called the EV Transition Explained. So it started as a 12-part series at IEEE Spectrum, and now they bundled it into an ebook. But yeah, I mean, it starts, goes from mining to the grid to consumption and whether there's any demand. I mean, it's fascinating watching the automakers really back off EVs right now because they just don't think the demand's there. But it's really and then there's the aftermarket repair stuff that you're emphasizing. I feel like I can't remember if Bob makes a big deal out of that or not in that ebook. But I mean, I feel like here's part of the issue is I think that, I was trained at Carnegie Mellon. I was in the history program and got my degrees in history and public policy, but I was also funded through something called engineering and public policy. And I think that, the main line there, and, it'll be interesting to think about how things have changed over time, is they were much more in favor of things like carbon taxes and performance standards and other kinds of tools that were kind of open on the technology. Like you would create you'd shift costs or do other things, and then you'd see what happened, right? But the worst nightmare is, what conservatives call picking winners, which is you're like, all right, we're going to do this technology now. And I just feel like the EV thing is the worst case of where we're just we've identified a technology and we're just we're going to go that way. And it's time out. Have you considered mining? Have you considered what this does to grids? Have you thought about aftermarkets? It's well, no, actually, I mean, it's really fascinating and scary.
Yeah. I mean, I'm almost intimidated talking about this with the person who wrote the book on the innovation delusion, right?
Yeah.
But I recently read Alex Davies' book on basically the history of AV, of AV technologies.
Okay.
He's a writer for Wired. He did some really cool work on this. And the thing that's, I think, emerged from that and a lot of other things is how much of this is just the fact that people cannot imagine anything cooler than a car. It's the scene from the Social Network, right? Where it's 1 million isn't cool. You know what's cool? Electric vehicles aren't cool. You know what's cool? Autonomous vehicles. It's just the same thing, but
right.
bigger or whatever.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be fair, the conservative policymakers and conservative analysts who are concerned about technology picking don't like EVs. Now, they don't like them for different reasons. There's a great piece in, I believe it was Slate by Alex Salmon about the American Dealership Association, or
Uh-huh.
the National Auto Dealership Association, NADA, NADA. If you haven't read this piece, very, very good beach reading. But basically detailing that like the push against EVs is coming from so many different reasons, having to do with climate change denial, having to do with like the sort of innate chauvinism of the automotive industry, right?
Mhm.
That like EVs are
Sure.
seen as emasculating for some reason.
Mhm.
Um, and things like that. But I agree that it's just it and to be fair to the Biden administration, right? They are also investing a lot in other forms of like mass transit infrastructure. I am
Yeah.
so excited about the high-speed rail plan that they put out. Um, Partially selfishly so because it would allow me to get back to my beloved Brooklyn from Charlottesville in like 2 hours
Yeah.
once they build it. But so I do think that at least this administration has a more um, holistic
Yeah.
vision of how of like mobility in the future. But I'm not seeing that reflected in smaller spaces. I'm not seeing that reflected in sort of pop culture imaginaries of like
Yeah.
socio-technical imaginaries to use the art discipline's term of
Yeah.
art. Um, that
Well,
like
it's just
they're
like
just one
at
of
the
those
state
things.
level too. I mean, like the Biden administration is one thing, but like California making these rules is another, and it's very clear that they didn't think through the kind of grid side of it, to give an example. And we're already seeing, like, Charette points out that like some California municipalities and areas are already seeing big grid problems around charging.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you really wanted to do the EV thing on a mass scale and really plan it, you would also plan around the grid in a really significant way. But we're just, it just seems like this kind of thing where it's like, all right, we're going to pick this technology, but like the kind of holistic vision of the shifts that really need to happen to make it happen didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm also really concerned about the like the longevity piece. I think for me is my
Yeah.
biggest concern is that um not to sound like old man yells at cloud, like we don't build them the way we used to, but we don't. Like,
Yeah.
there's a guy in Charlottesville who drives a Model T,
Yeah.
right?
Beautiful.
Like
Yeah.
this is a car that was built originally, and who knows, it might be a ship of Theseus, like
Yeah.
um
Probably is. Yeah.
right, but, even so, there are cars out there that are on the road that are from, like, the '50s and '60s and '70s with, a lot of their original parts, and that's good. It is good that these cars last a long time, and, those cars tend to be higher polluters, they're exempt from emissions standards and things like that.
Yeah.
However, I worry that our focus on carbon emissions is ignoring other impacts on the earth that the constant manufacture of these devices is also having.
Yeah.
And I worry that we are not building in requirements for the continued support of
Yeah.
these really advanced machines, right?
Right.
Like how
Right.
long will the operating systems on these cars be supported for?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What do we do with them when the operating system is no longer supported?
Yeah, and we already know that, oh man, I wish I had the numbers right here in front of me. I should have looked them up before. I just forgot. I didn't even make the connection. But Shret sent me some numbers recently of like how bad EVs are tanking in the secondhand market, and you just look like Kelly's Blue Book for
Yeah.
like like an internal combustion engine vehicle, and then like EV, and then it's just like the EVs are just tanking because everyone's worried about batteries or they're running low and blah blah blah. So yeah, I mean, I think there's big issues around longevity and the sustainability of the whole thing. So, another another thing you're looking at. So, really, for obvious reasons, because of the thrust of your research and a lot of the stuff you do, we've been talking about the aftermarket. But you also have a project on like how the auto firms themselves are relating to this, including the fact that they're kind of increasingly bringing in like software development teams. So, say a bit about that angle.
Yeah. So, I was reading the auto news as I was wont, and
Oh
I
yeah,
saw
that's a great. Oh man, I love it. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a wonderful publication. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I pick from a little bit of everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And I saw a headline from Hyundai where the CEO had announced that Hyundai was no longer a hardware manufacturer, that
Oh,
they are
yeah.
a software developer.
Uh, uh,
And I
uh,
was
uh.
like, "Whoa,
Yeah.
that's weird." And so I started digging into it a little bit, and this was, I mean, to our conversation about California, at about the same time that Cruise was being investigated by the state government for all the safety concerns, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cruise was found to have a Cruise being General Motors autonomous vehicle division, right? Which was a startup that General Motors acquired. And the result of that was that they were found to have lied on many documents, to have withheld data about safety testing from California regulators, and from parts of the company itself. And consequently, the CEO of Cruise was let go, right? And the press around him being let go was really interesting because it read like Hollywood gossip in a way that
Yeah.
I have not seen in the automotive industry before, where people were just throwing this guy absolutely under the bus or absolutely under the autonomous car, as the case.
Yeah.
Because that was the safety like incident that kicked
Yeah.
off the whole thing, was that someone was hit by one of their autonomous cars. But um and the gossip, like an anonymous person associated with Cruise or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like employees were saying that the CEO was let go because he was a software engineer first and had no business acumen, and no like automotive engineering experience, and therefore he didn't get it. He didn't understand how to run a division of a major automaker. And
Right.
I was like, oh, I mean, that's a good point, right? Like,
Yeah.
automotive corporations have been around for decades, if not centuries, some of them.
Yeah.
Um, and they have like ways of doing things that come from their sort of origins as mechanical, electrical engineers
Yeah.
and old school businessmen. And then they're starting to integrate these divisions that are software engineers, computer scientists, and people who cut their teeth on business modeled after big tech.
Mm-hmm.
Google, Amazon. And car companies are coming out and saying that they want Google and Amazon style profits. Like that's what they're reaching for. They don't see
Sure.
each other just as in competition with each other anymore. Like they're in competition now with these huge tech giants.
Right.
And so what I'm trying to study is this shift, right? Like what happens to an industry when they see themselves in competition with, both in terms of profits, in terms of markets, and in terms of labor force, right? Like they're
Yeah.
also competing to hire the same software engineers,
Yeah.
um, with companies that have very different profit models from them and very
Right.
different quality assurance systems from them and very
Yep.
different like models, even just at the pedagogical level, the way these people are trained,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like engineers become part of the National Society for Professional Engineers, which has a code of ethics. If you want to be licensed by them, you have to adhere to this code of ethics. It's a form of professionalization. There's no parallel to that in computer science and software development, not
Mm.
yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just trying to figure that out. It feels like a clash of titans. Um, and organizationally, like how that's playing out organizationally, I think is going to be fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine. It looks like a classic kind of professional uh turf war kind of thing that you find in like sociologists like Andrew Abbott, but also books like, Nathan Ensminger's like, Old Computer Boys Take Over book where it's just like, you have new types of people in an organization. They have different cultures and, as you're saying, different forms of training. Yeah, I think there's a lot of practice there, or like really, really interesting potential issues there. And then finally, you have a collaborative project with, is it Jess Rea, one of
Yeah.
your colleagues at UVA's School of Data Science, where you're looking at regulatory approaches to AVs and autonomous vehicle, or EVs and AVs, I guess. And what is it? Is it on the environmental implications of the data side of their story? So,
Yeah.
say a bit about that.
Yeah, so we're hoping to expand. We feel like the what we've noticed in regulatory spaces is that there's some very nascent attention to the environmental impact of data centers, right?
Hmm.
To the
Yeah.
sort of energy requirements they have, to the water requirements they have. Increasingly, people are writing about water, because
Yeah.
of all the cooling systems, right? Um, and then the environmental impact of electric vehicles, which mostly is about emissions, right?
Right.
And maybe a very little bit concerns about lithium and some research into making sure that these lithium batteries are recyclable and things like that, right?
Yeah.
But the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the sort of regulatory bodies that are responsible for dictating what automotive features are required or like mandatory on cars now are listing very towards like the very data intensive features as becoming mandatory.
Hmm.
Um, we're going to make those things mandatory. Then we have to reckon with the fact that making something data intensive means that this thing, automotive environmental impacts are now also part of the conversation about data environmental impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we're trying to discover whether that is a conversation that's happening in these spaces,
Yeah.
and if not, how we can initiate it.
Hmm.
My colleague Jess is very embedded in a lot of like civil society spaces for like data justice and things like that. And
Yeah.
so between the two of us, hopefully with my like automotive know-how and their data science, like data advocacy know-how, we can start these conversations in these spaces, both at the federal and the global level. We're hoping to bring this
Yeah.
to spaces in the UN as well.
That's cool. I don't know if you've ever come across my buddy Aaron Gordon. He used to be at Vice. He's now independent. But he's a really cool technology journalist. He's written a lot about infrastructure and maintenance stuff, but he also does a lot on cars and I don't know, he was blue skied. Is it called skeeting? I don't know what it's
Yeah.
called. But he did something on Blue Sky recently about the electricity needs of those AV systems, and shows that, like, you're just like it's AV systems in EVs, and it was just like all the environmental, not all, great deal of the environmental benefits get wiped out if you put AV systems in EVs, because they're so energy intensive when it comes to the data processing needs. So I
Yeah.
think you're right. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating problem. And I think the NHTSA, it's kind of like a NHTSA EPA tension, where there's like, what are we trying? It's a trade-offs issue, right? It's like, what are we trying to maximize here? And, what are the kind of opportunity costs and trade-offs that come from like going really AV for safety, maybe, but like then we're kind of losing sight of the environmental side. Is that what?
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think complicating this is that a lot of these AV technologies, and EV technologies are being built again with this sort of subscription model in mind,
yeah,
which then requires constant connectivity. Like there would be ways of doing this that are more like locally computed or like I mean, not all of them
yeah. Uh-huh.
would be doable locally, but like to have this coinciding with the rise of the subscription model, which requires this connectivity, requires this constant like oversight, um, is just eating up even more data and
Mhm.
even more energy.
Yeah.
And so it's not just AV as like a category on its own, although it is a lot about that, but it's also the way AV is being done in this moment, which
Yeah.
is within a certain profit model, a certain economic model, and a certain governance model
Mhm.
that it's adding trouble to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you and Aaron should talk at some point. He's a part of some research group right now looking at kind of the costs of data centers and stuff. So I think that he has a pretty kind of big picture view of between the autos and the data center side. So,
Yeah, I've been
um,
trying to follow all the poor Vice. Um,
oh, it's a sad story. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I'm Aaron, I might have Aaron on just to talk about the story of Vice, which was, run like a startup, unfortunately for it, and it's just run right into the ground.
Yeah. It's him and Jason Kobler that I've been following since they left, but
Yeah. So I mean, I feel like you got all this auto stuff, and I feel like you've got your career set for you. Yeah, is this it? I mean, this is like, you'll do this stuff, you'll continue to publish, and you'll get tenure, and then you could still do auto stuff for like the rest of your career and be good. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I definitely could. I definitely see the irony of it is that I'm a one car household. I don't like driving.
Yeah.
Our car is a stick shift 4-cylinder glorified golf cart that I love desperately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm hoping that this can morph into or like be a way for me to engage with like a broader community of people who are trying to think of like the sort of technology in the long term, like not just infrastructure folks. I'm hoping to get more consumer electronics folks
Yeah.
in these spaces, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
finding a lot of um sort of like-minded folks at the School of Architecture here at UVA,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
people who are about built environments and how we do built environments. Smart
Yeah.
cities people, I think, are getting, hopefully will start getting in on this conversation, because if there's one thing we build that's meant to last longer than cars, it's buildings.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And how are we wiring buildings or designing buildings to run on operating systems? Oh my God, like I have no words. How do you imagine that this building will
Yeah.
exist and function in 10, 20, 50 years? But I think people in architecture are do think about things in that way, the like time scale of things.
Yeah.
Um, I'm also and this is just I'm saying this to as many people as I can, because then I'm putting pressure on myself to actually follow through on it. Really hoping to do in the future a lecture series on the Fast and the Furious movie series. Um,
Yeah.
and
That's good. You know who you should invite is historians of science Michael Gordon and Erica Milam of Princeton University are not so secret Fast and the Furious fans, and I'm sure would have a ton to say about it. So
yeah, I'm hoping to get one engineer and one like person from the social sciences and humanities to talk about each movie and
yeah,
how like these different issues are represented and what their representation means. I think
yeah,
the Fast and Furious is a sort of really fascinating window into what we think cars are capable of, why we think they are cool, like what
yeah,
value they have as like symbols of freedom and family and
yeah, masculinity and all these things. Yeah.
yeah. Absolutely obsessed.
Let me ask you one more question. Going back to what you were saying about like consumer electronics and stuff, like. Are you finding discussions of the circular economy useful? I mean, it's way bigger in Europe, right?
Yeah.
And it's like first of all, I feel like it's a term that's not going to be with us in 10 years and we're going to call it somewhere else. I mean, it's that kind of like social fad energy around it. It's not going to I feel like it's not going to last, but also some of the versions of it, like I can't remember the foundation that was really pushing it. Is it like the no, I can't remember. Um I mean, it's not a regulatory vision very often. It's kind of like it seems like corporate goodwill kind of vision or something like that. To really do it, you're going to have to regulate, right? I
Yeah.
think. And so I don't know. Is that a discussion you're finding useful for thinking about this kind of umbrella issue, or like not so much these days?
Yeah, I mean, I am fascinated by the circular economy. I agree that there are ways where I think it doesn't quite capture what it thinks it's capturing, but other ways that I think it does, and ways that I think the right to repair movement in the United States in particular is really making use of, right? And
Right.
so,
Right.
and this is like, there's no advocacy movement that is, 100% everything you need it to be. One of my frustrations with the
Yeah.
right to repair movement is that the way it is structured, and it's structured to address like very specific problems through the very specific avenues of like what US regulation and like the US legal system makes possible. So this is in no way a critique.
Right.
But because of those very specific goals, it has a hard time attending to the initial design of these things, right? iFixit really tries to.
Yeah.
I think in their
Yeah.
product tear downs or breakdowns or whatever they call them.
Yeah. Yeah. Tear down.
Um,
Yep.
and I know that it is part of like their sort of vision of what they want to be pushing for.
Yeah.
Um, but I think to a certain extent, the circular economy push in the EU gets to that a little bit better because it's
Mm-hmm.
not just about the end. It's just not about the end.
Yeah.
About
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
repair, it sees this all as like a circular
Right.
thing. And I think that's useful. I think it's produced some things that we could consider adopting in the United States and that some people are pushing for. So things like grades for repairability, right? That
Yep.
products would be on their box would have a grade for how repairable they are.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that actually having some impact, right? Like Microsoft and Apple have both really made moves in the last few years towards like making the repairability of their devices part of
Yeah.
how they're marketing them. And then
Well,
other things in Europe about like how long,
it's like 10 years or something, right?
yeah,
That
how
things
long
have to be
products like spare
repairable for.
parts and support
Yeah.
services need to be provided for products. And
Yeah.
depending on, the type of product and depending on like where in the EU they are. But I think that would be a great step in the right direction.
Yeah.
We're capable of executing that in the United States in the regulatory environment we have.
You're right. I
Um,
mean, always a question.
yeah.
You gotta have, I think we have to have conversations about what would be ideal, realizing that our regulatory environment's fraught, and things are hard. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think part of my what I see my career is doing is sort of trying to unpack the harm that the American concept of personal property has done. Period.
yeah.
And our entire regulatory system is built around it. Like the state is there to protect property. We use force, like we authorize the use of force to protect property. IP, like the entire IP system is built around the idea of property. But that's gonna take a few maybe decades to unpack. I'm really inspired by work that I see really in STS in our field specifically. More and more people are doing work, paying attention to uplifting the work of indigenous and decolonial scholars who I think are coming out with the most exciting sort of alternate ways of viewing these things, like possible, like, just like alternate, like imaginaries, just, completely new ontologies. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I'm so jazzed to be an academic in this moment is because that work is finally getting its due. And so hopefully that, if we can integrate that more into the way that the US government works, I mean, not that there's been a ton of success in that in the past, but even if it makes its way into the way we teach, I think that could be really powerful. So,
Right on.
yeah.
Well, MC, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It was a lot of fun, buddy.
Yeah, it was good to see you, Lee. We should definitely continue these conversations going forward, for sure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.